Good day, everyone. Welcome to the Evolutions for Complexity, Fireside Chats with Dr. Naresh Singh. My name is Trey Ashley Guerin, and I have the privilege of engaging with Dr. Singh on this series as we discover, learn about, and feature the absolute wealth of boots on the ground fieldwork that's responding to the rapidly changing landscape of service in the name of the public. Of particular interest to both of us and the common ground that brought us together is our priority for well-crafted conversations and for the convening of diverse perspectives as a crucial means for how all of us may more deeply explore and harness what's working out in the field. We believe that our responsibility is to not only unearth the key purposes, principles, and practices that are contributing to a better world, but also to promote yet more and different initiatives, things that can midwife and effectively bridge build between the training that happens in the world of academia and the reality of what our leaders are encountering as they enter into, serve in, and advocate for the commons. So with that, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our raconteurs for today. Dr. Naresh Singh is currently professor at Jindal School of Government and Public Policy. He's director of Center of Complexity Economics and Applied Spirituality and Public Policy at Jindal Global University, special advisor on sustainability at Toronto Centre for Financial Leadership, and senior VP at Global Development Solutions Canada, a strategic advisory services firm in Canada. Naresh's scholarly work on complexity theory started about 25 years ago in his search for a theory of sustainable development during his tenure as program director at the International Institute for Sustainable Development in Canada, at which time he pioneered work on sustainability livelihoods. Later, as the Canada Trust visiting professor at the University of Waterloo, he helped advance work on systems approach to measuring sustainability with Professor James Kay. As a visiting scholar at Harvard University's Global Equity Initiative, he conducted work on societal systems approach to HIV and AIDS. More recently, he's been working with complexity-based approaches to integrative peace building at St. Paul University in Ottawa. Since 2018, he's taught a professional development course on policy and program design and evaluation in complex situations at the University of Ottawa, and his book chapter, Development as Emergent Creativity, is currently in press at this time of this recording. Dr. Singh has been a senior policy advisor to the governments of Canada, the Caribbean, the United Nations, and the Commonwealth, and further details of his work will be made available at the end of this recording. Now today, I also have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Singh's guest for today, Dr. Toby Lowe, who's currently serving as visiting professor for public management at the Center for Public Impact. He's currently performing his role on secondment from Newcastle Business School. Toby's leading CPI's work on public service reform, having developed an alternative approach to public management known as human learning systems. Toby's purpose is to enable public service to work more effectively in complex environments by undertaking active research programs rooted in design, implementation, and practice according to each citizen's strengths and needs, combining academic rigor with a focus on practical change. Previously, he worked for 15 years in the public and voluntary sectors in the UK. He's undertaken policy work on economic inclusion in both regional and national governments, and most recently was CEO of a charity tackling social exclusion in the northeast of England. Toby has a PhD in political theory from Newcastle University. His team at Newcastle Business School have been at the global forefront of developing practical, complexity-informed approaches to public management to help improve funding, commissioning, and the performance management of social interventions. Human learning systems approach that he developed has been adopted by a range of public and voluntary sectors in the UK, with conversations commencing globally in countries like Finland, Australia, New Zealand, Brazil, with Canada and India on the way. I've had the pleasure of being in one-on-one conversations with both of these gentlemen, and I'm absolutely honored to be sharing this space as a fly on the wall of this fireside chat today. And so with that, I'm going to pass the baton on to you. Naresh?
Well, thank you very much, Ray. And Toby, what a delight. Great to have you. Great to have you on today. And I look forward to engaging with some of this exciting stuff that you've been doing. In my work with governments over the years, and I've, like Trey mentioned, I've had the opportunity to work with many governments around the world, maybe more than 50, but most importantly, maybe with governments of the Caribbean and the government of Canada, and some amount of work in the UN. One of the things that struck me about the work that you do, and the observations you have made, is about outcome-based performance measurement, which obviously is what governments still do. That's how development programs run their work. So maybe you can share with us a little bit about the challenge. What's the problem with outcomes-based performance management?
Thank you, Naresh. It's a real pleasure to be in conversation with you. So my journey thinking about these ideas started with being contracted and performance managed using an outcome-based performance management system. So the charity that I was chief executive of, we had long-term partnerships with different local authorities and kind of other aspects of government. And kind of 2/3 of the way through the 10-year partnership we had with one organisation, the contracting manager said to me, Toby, if you want your money next year, you're going to have to claim that you produce these particular set of outcomes, because the council that I work for has adopted the outcomes-based accountability framework. So I'm now responsible, he said to me, I'm now responsible for these particular set of outcomes. So if I'm going to contract you for this work with young people that we've been doing together next year, you need to claim that you achieve these outcomes. And I said to him, no, hang on a minute. You know that I couldn't in all conscience claim that we make those outcomes for these young people, because we do so in partnership with your youth workers and all the range of all the other things that are going on in these young people's lives. And he said to me, I know that. He said, I know that that's not true, but I just need you to write this on this form in order for us to give you your money again.
There you go.
So I said to him, you want me to lie to you on your forms? Yes, he says, that's exactly what I need you to do. And at that point, something in my head just went snap, because I had a vision of all, like the senior executives for the local authority, all looking at their dashboards of outcomes data, congratulating themselves on how well their programs were performing. And none of it was true. None of it was true. I was like, how can any of this get any better if we've created a performance management system where people systematically lie to each other? So that was my kind of starting point for that. It was that set of experiences that made me go, we must be able to do it better than this, right?
That's right. And outcomes, obviously, we have been using this linear logical framework where inputs lead to outputs lead to outcomes of various levels, and then develop all these crazy objectively verifiable indicators which measure a bunch of stuff that is really in the interest of the company funding this work rather than in the interest of the beneficiaries who are supposed to benefit.
Exactly so. And the kind of my first step after this, something in my brain going snap, was so one of my friends did a life-changing thing for me. Actually, he said, after I'd unloaded all this to him in the pub one time, he said to me, why don't you go and talk to the business school about this? I think they would be interested. I was like, okay then. So and that led me to doing research onto outcomes-based performance management. So my re-entry into academia was doing research into what is known about how outcome-based performance management work. And to my surprise, there's a whole ton of research studies about this stuff.
Right.
Like there is evidence up to here about what happens when people implement outcome-based performance management. And it pretty much all says the same thing, that it kind of verified the experiences that I had had as a charity chief executive, in that the evidence says it creates gaming, so it turns everyone's job into the production of good-looking data, and creates perverse incentives and blah, blah, blah. So all the things that I'd experienced are all the things that are repeated in these research studies that are done about the implementation of this.
Right.
And so I began to wonder, if we know all of this stuff, why do we keep doing it? So that was the question that, and and it was that exploration that led me into the field of complexity, because to try and understand why outcome-based performance management fails so consistently in exactly the ways that it does all the time, you need complexity theory, I think, to help explain that, and for exactly the reasons that you just described. In the outcome-based performance management is predicated on the idea that the world that it describes is simple, linear, and controllable. And the world of public management, of public service, of public policy, if you were to pick any 3 words in the world to describe that environment, you wouldn't pick simple, linear, or controllable, right?
That's right. That's designed for the managers, the people who have to manage, rather than for the reality. So, you know, in the history of, you look at public administration and how it has evolved. And while I was in government myself in the public service of Canada, we were engaged in what is called, as you know, the new public management. And of course, we had the traditional public administration, which are rules-based. And so the thinkers in the field sort of said this rules-based administrative approach was not delivering. So we needed this new management approach, new public management approach, which would be focused more on markets approach, more private sector kind thinking, right? But the NPM, as we used to call it, that of course is not designed to deal with the reality we are talking about. What are your thoughts on NPM?
So I think it's so important to name the public management paradigm that that still dominates public management thinking and practice to this day, because one of the challenges that we've experienced in enabling people to think and act differently in a kind of public management context is new public management has become so ubiquitous that many people have forgotten that it is a paradigm, that it is a created thing and a set of human choices about how to do management. So a colleague of mine was doing a presentation for 100 of the most senior civil servants in the UK from right across government. And he asked them, how many of you people have heard the expression new public management? Guess how many of the 100 most senior civil servants in the UK had heard the expression new public management? None. Not a one. This was last year. And it was so striking to us because it's to me exemplifies the idea that fish don't have a word for water.
Yeah.
Right. And this is important because if you can't name a thing, you can't recognize that it is a choice to do it like this or like this, right? And so one of the starting point for the presentations that I frequently give now is to name new public management, to do it in exactly the way that you just did, Naresh. Say new public management known as the 3 M's: markets, managers, metrics. And then say, but the problem with new public management is all the evidence says that it fails in complex environments. and you can introduce all sorts of evidence, but that I think, like, naming the way management happens is within a particular paradigm, and that the choice that senior leaders face is essentially which paradigm they're going to use to look at the world. I think that's so crucial. And I would be curious to know what your experiences of trying to develop kind of similar thinking are in that space.
Right. And you see, the new public management, the mantra used to be, let the managers manage. So it was appealing to senior managers because it seemed to liberate them, to give them freedom from all the rules and the administrative structures in which we were sort of, if you like, to which we were subjected in the past. So for that reason, it was quite welcome. Now, when you look at the challenges we are talking about, what were we delivering on? We continue to deliver on these outcomes-based approaches, predefined outcomes, and at the same time urging people to be innovative. You know, the guide for the Canadian Public Service is value for money. So we should be producing best value for a given investment. Well, we know how to count the money, but we didn't know how to count the value, clearly. And trying to get this kind of thinking that we are talking about, or the shift away, has been the challenge. You know, so that leads us then, I guess, to the very interesting work that you've been doing on human learning systems, and what you see as some possible solutions. And you know, we would have to talk a little bit about how to get this into actual practice. But first, maybe a few thoughts on, you know, those key ideas in human learning systems, and then we'll talk a little bit about practice.
Thank you, Naresh. Yeah, so once we had come to realize that complexity breaks new public management, we asked, we were kind of, okay, we know what the problem is, but what does different look like? And because when we were able to kind of prove beyond kind of reasonable doubt that outcome-based performance management creates gaming in complex environments and all this kind of stuff, we were able to use complexity theory to explain why the existing evidence says that it says the things that it says. So, okay, we know that outcome-based performance management doesn't work in complex environments and can't be made to work. That's the kind of crucial thing about it. So when we discovered that, we took it out to, we thought, you know, that's quite an important message. We should tell people about that. So we put on kind of like 14 or 15 like practitioner facing conferences around the UK. I think we spoke to maybe 500-600 people. Said, this thing that you're all doing, outcome-based performance management, not just it doesn't work, but you can't make it work. And like, I felt like that was going to be quite a controversial message. And I thought we would get quite a lot of pushback from people. What do you mean it doesn't work? We make it work like this and this and this. Actually, what people said was, well, of course it doesn't work. But what on earth else are we going to do? I was like, oh, I see. There was me thinking that the problem was that you didn't know this didn't work and you needed me to come along and tell you, which was a kind of really stupid proposition. As soon as you say it out loud, you're like, oh yeah, that wasn't very smart. But they're literally kind of pointing at us on stage, like when in the days where you can still actually meet people and go, what else can we do? I was like, oh, okay. It's the job of someone at a business school to answer the question, what else can we do? Like, okay. So that's when we began this exploration. And so we knew that it was we knew that the current stuff fails because it fails to deal with complexity. So we thought, whatever the next thing is, it at minimum, it has to start by embracing the complex reality of the world. So we found a bunch of organizations that looked like they were doing things very differently in both kind of public and voluntary sectors. And so we simply asked them the question, how do you experience and respond to complexity? So just literally did an interview like this. How do you experience and respond to complexity was our kind of starter for 10 question. And when we asked them that question, they started talking about relationships and trust. Ooh, that's interesting. How do you use relationships and trust in managing complexity? And that began our learning about what an alternative public management paradigm that works in complex environments can look like. And we launched our first report in May 2017, I think. And ever since then, we've been learning more and more and more and more. And our current articulation of this we describe this as human learning systems. And I can say a little bit more about that if that's...
What do you measure now? I mean, if you don't do outcomes-based measure, so what do we measure? Relationships and trust?
So this is people get very exercised by the question, what should we measure? And what should we measure is an important question. But one of the things we discovered is the question what we should measure is secondary to the question, why are we measuring?
Okay.
And so the key shift that folks who are using a human learning systems approach make, or one of the key shifts, is they use measurement for learning rather than for accountability.
Okay.
So learning is essentially the engine for performance improvement rather than vertical accountability. So this is the L in human learning. This is the learning in human learning systems, right? So measurement becomes in the service of performance improvement. Because we know, like this, one of the shocking things that I kind of discovered as I became a researcher in this field was the existence of something called Campbell's Law. Are you familiar with Campbell's Law, Naresh? So from an American social science professor in the late 70s, Donald Campbell, he wrote a very famous essay at the time, assessing the impact of planned social change.
Okay.
And in it, he formulated what became known as Campbell's Law, so I can get this right. Any quantitative indicator used for the purpose of social decision-making will tend to distort and corrupt the processes it is intended to monitor. Right? We've known this since 1979. And yet all of new public management is basically founded on ignoring that truth. And so what people measure in human learning systems approach is in essence answered by the question, what would help you do your job better? And so people measure whatever it is that they need to get the feedback on to do their job better. So obviously the experiences of citizens, it's really important to capture data on and to get feedback on. You can, if you're interested in improving the quality of relationships between people in a system, which is one of our key kind of points of knowledge was that it's systems produce outcomes, not organizations, right? Hundreds of different factors all working together is what actually makes an outcome in someone's life. So if you care about outcomes, you need to care about the quality of interaction between those different elements. So in short, healthy systems produce better outcomes. So if it's my job to nurture a healthy system, what are the different indicators that I would measure in a system to know whether it's healthy, whether the actors in it are able to coordinate and collaborate effectively? Those are the kinds of things that people measure.
Okay. There are two things that arise from that, though. The one is the big thing in government, obviously, as we all know, is accountability. So we can, talk about all these wonderful things that need to happen. And if my minister, let's take a flashback to when I served in government, if I can't arm my minister to go to Parliament and explain to Parliament on behalf of the Canadian people, what have we done with their taxpayers' money, we have a big problem.
Yeah.
So how would we deal with accountability in this human learning system?
So this is I'm really pleased you asked that question, Naresh, because this is one of the key areas that we're still learning about. because accountability and accountability narratives are going to drive any government process in exactly the way that you described, right? So one of the key areas of research at the moment is, what does accountability look like in complex environments? Because the starting point for this is that our conception of accountability at the moment is broken, doesn't work, right? So there is an awful lot of pretending happening right now in the name of accountability, right? So we pretend that ministers are accountable for the results of education systems, right? Or we pretend that you can contract with an organization for employability support and you can hold them accountable for whether people get jobs or not. It is a nonsense to use those forms of accountability because it's just not true. And anything that in the end isn't true isn't helpful, right? And so this is our starting point, right? Accountability, our version of accountability right now is broken. It's essentially a fib, right? So what forms of accountability work in complex environment that allow us to do useful work? And the first thing is reclaiming what accountability actually means, because we've shrunk the word accountability to mostly mean counting. Mm-hmm. Whereas, like, let's listen to ourselves say the word accountability, right? It's about providing an account. And so when the minister is saying, standing up in Parliament and saying, okay, provide an account of what you have done with these resources, mm-hmm. that's a little bit of numbers and a lot of story, mm-hmm. right? So, because you are providing an account of something. We did this because of that, and this was our judgment around this. So, the act of providing an accountability is one person providing an account to another of why they did something, right?
So you would go the route. You would go the route of stories.
Well, so stories are an important part of this, right? But it's also, it has to be a dialogue, right? Because if in order to provide and understand an account that someone gives. So if I ask you, Naresh, why did you spend these resources on that? Why did you spend $100 million on fighting poverty in X place in this particular way? What could you say to me that would help me understand why you made the judgments that you did?
And you know, I'll tell you what I'll say to you as Toby, but I'll tell you also what I'll have to say to the minister. I will have to say to the minister, 5,000 households have better income now as a result of our investment. I might say to you, I have heard people describe how their lives have changed. How their kids can go to school and they, and do better. And then I will start to sort of spread out from that and tell stories of how lives have actually changed. And maybe the answer is a combination of the two.
Indeed, and because one of the other changes around accountability that we think might be important, because we don't know any of this stuff yet, and this is why the glorious thing that I'm getting to do at the moment is this as action research, because we haven't got any answers in advance to the question, what should accountability look like in this? Because accountability is a social process happening out in the world, right? We can only know whether it's right by experimenting and trying with different processes and seeing what works in which kind of context, right? Mm-hmm. So what kinds of accountability enable like our democracy to function effectively, to enable a minister to say to our citizens, like, we did this because of this was our judgment, like, hold me accountable for whether you think my judgment was right or not. Mm-hmm. In that, it's essentially what people are saying, right? We have to enable people to explore what different forms of accountability look like.
Have you written some of this stuff up? Is it available?
Yeah, so we're just about to, I've been working with some academics at the University of New South Wales in Canberra and the Australian Tax Office, and we're 95% through a paper on complexity and accountability. So fingers crossed that will be all available very soon.
Right, that will be very useful, and it will become credible if a government is involved in this. Otherwise, governments dismiss, oh, that's NGO stuff or that's academic stuff, not relevant here.
And again, one of the things I'm curious about is the role of kind of boundary spanners in this space, because academia, it's too easy for academia to just kind of end up talking to itself about a bunch of these things. And it's too easy for governments to ignore the interesting research that's happened. So one of the ways to address that kind of divide, I think, is to frame research as action research, right? It has to involve the people who are seeking to change stuff in their own research processes. And I'm kind of curious to know both how your center engages in that kind of action research and kind of personally your experience of that kind of work.
Right. So I'll answer that in a second, but I don't want us to lose this point. We are talking a lot about complexity. And as we know, both you and I have worked in this field for quite a while, the word complexity tends to turn people off in government. We have to be able to communicate that what we are talking about is a reality that for too long we have turned our eyes away from. Back in the day when we had to make things so simple as to be manageable by the then managers and continue to do so in a world that's no longer like that. And even then, back in the day, the public service managers were ignoring that complexity. But in a way, complexity is the simplest of things in everyday life, but not for the rules of an organization. So it's looking through the lens of an organization that the world might look complex. Through the eyes of people making their living every day, they change their minds every minute. They make multiple decisions. Poor people don't have jobs, they do jobs. And if you look at the labor market theory or you try to do labor market analysis, it's impossible for any of the theorians of labor market economics to work unless people have jobs. And there is something called a job. So, in poverty, that's why, I found in the field that poor people relate so well. It's their life. They relate much easier to complex adaptive systems than the bureaucrats or, the so-called policy advisors or policy entrepreneurs who try to fit the real world into their existing theoretical models.
I think that point is so important, Naresh. What it makes me think is, so firstly, absolutely, I have a really similar set of experiences that if you were looking to invent something that was able to deal with and respond to complexity, you'd invent something like a human being, right? Human beings, we navigate complexity in all aspects of our lives every single day, right? Like anyone who has ever tried to raise a child, for example, knows that there's no rule book for doing this. You need to respond because it's different every day, and things that worked one day don't work the next day, blah, 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 right? Human beings are brilliant at navigating complexity because we have to be, because that's the reality of the world. And I just kind of picking up on your point about particularly people who experience poverty understand and accept complexity. Because I wonder whether there's some correlation between that and relative lack of expectation of being in control of stuff.
They have accepted that they are not in control.
Exactly. And that's not the case for our bureaucrats and senior politicians, right? We have created a social narrative where we expect them to be in control of stuff, to get a grip of things.
See, and that might be the ultimate shift that is required. And we will have to include that in our work somehow.
Exactly.
Probably
so,
need to work on psychology and other issues.
And that's entirely, I think that's entirely right. So helping leaders to give up the illusion of control is, I think, a really significant aspect of this work. So yeah, we can see what some of the levers might be for that, because so if you look at Harold Macmillan's famous quote, UK Prime Minister saying, "What was it that ended your rule in the UK?" He said, "Events, dear boy, events." Right? Politicians know that the world is too complex for them to control. Right? They know this deep down, and yet we have created this expectation to do this impossible thing. So I think there is space for a shared learning that would enable us all to give up this expectation that they're in control of stuff.
Right.
But that's a shared task we need to do together, right?
So it's a far way to go. So to come back to the question you asked about what the center will do and how we're going to tackle some of these issues. So we have sort of defined and put, all these problems and some potential solutions on the table. So what the center is going to try to do is sort of exactly what we've been talking about, but perhaps in a slightly different way. Of course, you come from academia yourself, so in the university, of course, we would be looking at teaching. So the next generation, hopefully, and I'm going to be teaching, and the center is in the School of Government and Public Policy. So the location is perfect. The faculty, we would have to work with faculty to get their heads in a different place. So that's one. Two, students will be taught, hopefully, in a different way and shown alternative ways of thinking, not throwing out right away what they've been studying all the time. That will be too catastrophic, too disruptive to their systems, but melding it and bringing it in. Then we are planning to do action research. It's not only about teaching. So we run an MA in public policy, for example, and our students and PhD program is hopefully on its way. We are also establishing broad collaborations, and India is such an important country in the world that I didn't realize how important that aspect would be in setting up the center in India. I believe that half of the people who become excited by the work we are planning to do are excited by the substance, half of them, and half is excited by the fact that it's going to be done in India. Because this is such a big economy. It is the largest economy in terms of people and interactions among people. It's not yet the world's second or third largest economy, but it's getting there. It's probably 5 or 6 right now or something like that. And we have to show the world an alternative to China. We can all become like China, I guess, and have all these crazy growth rates, but then also have no home at the end of the day and have no planet, and have no freedoms and have no press and all of that stuff. So this is the great opportunity. So we're going to have courses, graduate courses. We're going to have student research, and I'm hoping more action research. And networking and advocacy, all built into the work of the center. Now we have just started. The center was established in September this year. So we are now laying out the courses and so on. We are drawing from complexity theory. So one stream of work is called complexity economics. I would have much preferred the name complexity sciences or complexity theory, but that was strategically chosen. Because you're in the School of Public Policy, people can relate more to the word economics. But that's a Trojan horse. You know, we're going to do what we need to do anyway. The second stream is on quantum social science. Now, a lot of ideas, really interesting and powerful thoughts and ideas are coming out of this field called quantum social science, where the formalisms and the theories of quantum physics are useful for social science. Mm-hmm. That's one aspect. And the other aspect are the analogies. The analogies of quantum physics are so much closer to reality than the classical Newtonian world. And yes, the sciences have moved forward. You know, complexity science is relatively new, and so quantum social science. So we're going to draw from that as well. The third area, which is an area I want to explore with you as well, is called applied spirituality and public policy. Now, in your human systems learning, the one part that I think we need to bring into that equation is the interiority of the human. You see, and I'm going to introduce to the class the integral approach of Ken Wilber and these 4 quadrants and so on, which I think are helpful to think about the world and make meaning. And we don't bring enough of this spiritual understanding, the understanding of who we are, going beyond. Clearly, you know, it's so simple. Clearly, we are not our bodies, yet we go around as though we were our bodies. So that's one illusion. And we tend to be led by a figment of imagination called the ego, which needs more and more for its satisfaction. But in contemplative practices and so on, you quickly realize that it's a figment and it's driving you nuts. And there are things you can do about it. And what one finds, and after several years of digging, I have found, is that the spiritual wisdom, the gems of each of the major religions, the mystical core is the same. The organized religion is where the confusion begins. And these are just other institutions for their own gain, and same problems, right? So we are in fact having a panel next week on applied spirituality and public policy. So the question here is, you know, and there are books now addressing the subject. I'll give you one quick example as we move on. The Rabbi Michael Lerner in the US wrote a book called Revolutionary Love, published a year or 2 ago. And he's a political scientist, academic, and rabbi. And his question is, what would public policies in the United States look like if the outcome was increased love in the society? How would we design our institutions in order to achieve that outcome? And then he says, ask the American people if love is not a desirable outcome. Not the American government. But if you're a democracy and you're a government of, by, and for the people, then we should be asking these questions.
I think it's so interesting that you've mentioned the word love, Naresh, because it's something that we've started to hear in the amongst the groups of organizations who are adopting human learning systems approach. And this is kind of, as I think you were beginning to identify the human bit of human learning systems, right? I realize I never did give you a basic description of what human learning systems is. I can do that in a bit if you'd like. But the kind of the essence of the human bit of human learning systems is both the provision of public service and the management of public service, as if we are all fully rounded human beings all the time. And when you look at so much about what public service is, then public service is about care for people. right? And so, and particularly when we explored this stuff in the space of kind of children's social care, for example, and particularly when the state has to take responsibility for children's welfare, when the state becomes like the corporate parent that has to look after a child, then that places public policy firmly in the realm of love. Right? Because if a state becomes a corporate parent for a child, a child needs love. That is the kind of the fundamental basis for raising children, right? Is they need a sense of unconditional love and that form of kind of security that type of relationship, that type of human relationship gives, right? And so if we can't talk about love in public service terms, we will always fail those aspects of public service that are about kind of care for one another.
And you talk as well in your work on human systems, Toby, you talk about the, caring and empathy, and I think you talk about 4 things about being more human, if I recall correctly.
So exactly. So the when we and this I'll start this particular bit of story with the evolution of language that we use to describe this work, because when we first kind of published a report on this, we didn't really call the alternative approach anything, and because we didn't call it anything, like by default people started calling it complexity informed practice. And this kind of touches on the point that you were making about, does the language of complexity put people off or not? And like at that point we heard a lot of people saying, like, don't talk to me about the language of complexity, because like my job is difficult enough, and you're saying it needs to be more difficult. So we thought the language of complexity informed practice wasn't helpful, partly because of it could put some people off, but also from my perspective, the complexity theory describes why we need to do things differently. It doesn't offer a description of what different looks like. And so this is why we kind of changed the language to human learning systems, because we spent a lot of time just listening to the language that was spoken by the people doing the work. And the first thing we noticed was that when we spent time with these organizations, within the first 10 minutes, universally, someone said something like, well, this is just about being more human to each other, isn't it? Oh, that's fantastic language. Let's write that down. That's a chapter heading. That's all right. But then, like, because we're academics, and at least partly in this space, we're like, okay, what do you mean by being more human? Because that could mean a lot of things, right? And so when we dug into that, it seemed to mean 4 things, people. So firstly, that people responded to the variety of human experience and need, because there are as many ways to be human as there are human beings. So when public service is being human, what that seemed to mean is that it produces a bespoke response to each and every human need, strength and need. And the only way that a public service can provide a bespoke response to each and every person is that if it's built on strong relationships. Because the only way a public service worker can understand the strengths and needs of each and every person is if they have a high quality relationship with them. So first one was about variety. And then the second bit was about empathy, because if you're going to understand that diversity of experience of strengths and needs, and that means that you need to put yourself as a public service worker into the lives of others. That is a hard task, right? To genuinely understand the life of another through their eyes is a significant skill that requires us building our empathy. Our empathic skills. So variety, empathy, strengths. Like this was a kind of language that we used to describe the way that public services working in a human learning systems way would treat people as whole human beings. Because of the fragmentation in new public management, public service has tended to treat people as if they are carriers of the problem of that's on the sign above the door. So a mental health service sees someone as someone with a mental health problem. A drug and alcohol service sees someone as someone with a drug and alcohol problem. Right? It's kind of natural when you parcel up things in that way. What we saw was a whole bunch of public service and voluntary organizations and the kind of broader social intervention space saying, labeling you in that way isn't actually very helpful. I need to get to know you as a human being. I need to get to know whether you're a mother or a father, whether you're a sibling, or whether you like to take your dog for walks on the beach, or whether you like football, or blah, 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 what your spirituality is. Because all of those things are important and relevant for the work that we need to do together. And finally, trust. Because if you're going to provide this bespoke response, if, as we believe, the future of public service is bespoke, then there's only two sets of people who really know enough to understand and make decisions about whether a public service does this or that in someone's life. Those two sets of people are the citizen themselves and the worker who has a strong enough relationship with them to really understand them. No one else has enough knowledge, and this is kind of coming back to the complexity thing, right? No one else has enough knowledge of that detailed context to make that effective decision. So you need to devolve decisions about what public service does in that person's life into that relationship, because no one else can know. No one can predefine criteria and make it work except those folk. So variety, empathy, strength, and trust seems to be what people meant by being more human to one another.
You know, when they point about strength, I think you will find it interesting to know that in my work on poverty and sustainable livelihoods, we start not with what people need, but with what they have. It's called the assets approach.
Yes, yes.
And you might not believe the revolution this created in the work of the United Nations program on a development program on poverty reduction. When I wrote my first paper, it was called The Wealth of the Poor, and Building on Assets, and they refused to publish it because they said, what nonsense is this? These things don't go together. How can the poor have any wealth? You know, and that started this sort of revolution. And I've worked with that, and appreciative inquiry, which I'm sure you work with as well.
Yes, yes.
And we will have to bring this more into this work.
100% agree. 100%. And I think there is complexity in understanding the assets that people have, because viewing people as having strengths and having assets, from my perspective, doesn't mean they also don't have needs.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In fact, that comes, but we start with strengths.
Yes.
For obvious strategic reasons.
I think this stuff is so important because if you view this kind of public service role as a kind of developmental role on a micro level, right? And the question that public service is essentially asking is, how can I help you to lead the life that you want to live? Right. Then that question, if you start that discussion and dialogue from a deficit-based approach, then it makes it more difficult, I think, to build effective human relationships with that person. I mean, someone might want to talk about the pain that they're experiencing and the problems that they have, but if that's where they want to start, okay, that's fine. Yeah. But let's not trigger that in the conversations that we have.
Right. So Toby, it's important, I think, for us, hopefully range of different kinds of people might listen to this, and some might be public servants, hopefully, and of course some students at the university. And so people might want to know, do these things, can they really work, these ideas we are talking about? And the first question, at least in the professoriate, will be, where is it working now? Have you tried it somewhere? Is it happening? What are people doing out there? What's your experience?
So this is, I love, this is, to me, it's such a joyous question to answer, this one, because all that we've learned about human learning systems approach comes from observing and supporting other people's learning. So everything that we know about human learning systems comes from people doing this stuff right now. So, because essentially what we're talking about is paradigm shift in public management, right? And the way, what we've done with the human learning systems is tell an alternative story about how the world can be. But paradigm shift.
Governments, huh? Don't forget governments. Are governments adopted?
So what we've seen, where this as an alternative public management paradigm has come from, where it started was by and large the local governance scale. So in a UK context, that's local authorities, so local government, local aspects of the National Health Service, local charitable organisations. So they began this kind of revolution in doing public management differently. And we learned, so places like Plymouth, which is a city in the southwest of England, they have undertaken commissioning of whole systems of support for adults who've experienced homelessness, mental health problems, substance misuse, those kind of cluster of things that can happen in people's lives. So they've done an £80 million 10-year commission of a system of support. So they turned it from a new public management contracts previously, where there were 29 separate contracts with 29 different organizations, to one alliance contract for a whole system of organizations. And because of the relationship building work, the trust building work, the focus on learning that they have been able to undertake, they were able to issue this £80 million contract with no key performance indicators, no targets, nothing, none of that.
Outside of the UK, is anything
in the UK?
I know, but I was just asking.
Then if you look at charitable foundations in the United States, like the Whitman Institute, for example, they've pioneered an approach called trust-based philanthropy, whereby what they seek to do is to find organizations that they can trust with the resources, build relationships with them, and say to those organizations, you know best what to do with those resources, we don't. We trust you to use these resources in whatever ways you deem most appropriate, and we will help you learn, and we will help you convene learning environments around this. And so this stuff started at a local governance level, and now in the UK is building kind of significant momentum as more and more people join in with this. So now there are other local authorities starting. So the purpose of my secondment at the Centre for Public Impact.
Right.
So
you read my mind. That's where I was going.
So I've moved from Newcastle Business School to the Centre for Public Impact because the Centre for Public Impact has relationships with governments all over the world. So our mission as an organisation is to help reimagine government. And so CPI is a really interesting platform because it's enabled me to ask the question, which bits of which national governments are interested in exploring what a human learning systems approach would look like at a national government level? Because we know a lot of what the picture looks like at a local governance level, but what would a national government do if it adopted human learning systems approach? And I'm 6 months into this comment, so I've been putting out a whole bunch of feelers. Who's interested in exploring this question? And we've, in some respects, quite surprisingly, been kind of overwhelmed with a positive response. I know. So, for example,
from national level governments.
From national level governments. So, for example, the Finnish government, and particularly the Finnish Ministry of Education. So firstly, Finnish government explicitly adopting a complexity-informed approach. So they have done like training courses on complexity for all their ministers and senior civil servants and all this kind of stuff. Amazing. And you look, in particular, we're just starting to work with the Finnish Ministry of Education Innovation Centre, because what they've conceived their task, their job, as supporting the learning and experimentation of local places, of cities, of schools, of teachers, of parents, blah, 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 blah. So you've got an arm of central government who've been explicitly developed not to try and control how education is delivered in local areas, but to say, our job is to help you learn better about how to do education in the best possible way. And we know that this stuff kind of works because Finland is the #1 ranked education system in the world, right? So
there we go. The Nordics, trust the Nordics to want to adopt some innovative ways of doing things. It's good that we are hearing the UK is becoming interested. Is the Boris Johnson government at all interested?
So there is different bits of the UK public sector that has become interested. So we're having some really interesting conversations with the NHS in England. Also, the Scottish government we're having some really interesting conversations, and particularly kind of how healthcare works in Scotland.
And the developing world, outside of the developed?
So, I mean, the one of the other places that's really interesting, where we're having interesting conversations, is with the new Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office in the UK government. So the merger of the Department for International Development and the Foreign Office. So in doing research with them, we've found a whole range of their programs under the Learn Adapt banner, which have been adopted a whole set of these ideas of focusing on learning as the kind of primary role of management. And so there's in the development space, I think they've done some really interesting stuff with this kind of adaptive management kind of frameworks and thinking. I think the next breakthrough with them will be, how can they really trust those adaptive management processes? How can, like, previously they've been trying to constrain those adaptive management processes within a new public management box. And we're kind of having conversations with them to say, look, this adaptive management stuff you're doing is working, but it would work so much better if you just let it escape this box that is really, really unsuitable for it.
Absolutely. Anything in Canada?
So we've begun conversations with Trey and a couple of other colleagues in public service, conversations in Canada at both a kind of local and national scale. They're quite early days conversations. I mean, the thing to say about all of this is the human learning system stuff isn't a model. It's not a recipe to follow. It's not something that you can take from one place and put down in another. Every single organization place that adopts this human learning systems approach is essentially running their own experiment into how the principles apply in their context. So the adoption of a human learning systems approach has to be an example of itself. Right. It has to be a learning process, and each place that trying it is essentially an experiment in doing public management differently that has to have like proper rigorous learning stuff wrapped around it. So the conversations that we at CPI are having with people is, what help do you need in creating your own experiments into trying this stuff?
Well, brilliant. That leads us to India and to the center. And one of the things I'd like to see is maybe, some kind of a seminar or a course even, where people begin to think. It will be a different kind of course because you're not presenting a set of established axioms, so to speak, but you are getting people to begin to learn in a different way, and designing such a course in the center with CPI might be of interest. So that's one thing. Now, you had asked me earlier a question about India. India is a very interesting place, and the idea of working with spirituality and public policy in India is interesting for many reasons. India is seen as a country with a rich historical legacy of spiritual thought and lofty philosophies and so on. It also got bogged down into a bunch of perverse outcomes of religion, such as the caste system and so on. But it, to a large extent, the colonial legacy is still dominant. The British imperialist approach and its traditional public administration is what is dominant in India. And so, the UK well, and that alone tells you a lot about what India is, except perhaps that it's much worse. So somebody had said that the United Kingdom invented bureaucracy in government and the Indians perfected it.
Nice.
So that's to give you a little frame. But we talked a little bit earlier, but there is potential for change. There is a bunch of younger people now going to university, looking at the world. And one of the advantages of this university with which I'm affiliated, the O.P. Jindal Global University, is its global outreach. And many of the students who come there, they end up going up to do other degrees internationally. And we set up a lot of collaborative links, like our work on complexity economics. We had Dawn Farmer of the Oxford School, the George Soros School on Complexity Economics at Oxford, be part of the opening session. And Dawn has agreed for us to collaborate in certain ways. So our students get that broader feel as well. So in India, I wonder if I put on the table, might we conceive of a CPI India?
So funny you should say that, Naresh, because some of my colleagues are exactly beginning to think about that right now. So that's a conversation that we would love to have. So
Okay.
Let's definitely do that.
Right. I think India is going to be a very interesting experimental ground. It is a federal system like Canada or Nigeria and so many others. And so it has states. So even if we can't, because it's so huge, if we can't do much, or maybe we can do both. So because we are talking about a both and world rather than an either or world. So we might be talking about, state government, local governments, municipalities, but also the union government in New Delhi. And our school, one of its good advantages is its links to the public policy makers in India, both at the state level and at the union level. So that should give us good entree. And then, of course, we, as part of the university network, and India has thousands of universities, for experimental work. And so we could start something really, really fascinating. And since we share the same vision, maybe we should indeed talk more about this.
100%. So let's make that commitment straight away. We can put we should put a date in the diary for a conversation to talk about a potential relationship between ACPI India and your center, and yeah, we should definitely have that exploration.
What I'd like to do is I would like to share this conversation with the dean and some of my other colleagues, so they get a sense of what we are talking about. And then, let's have that other conversation after I get some feedback, so I get a sense of their interest and their willingness to go ahead with this idea. Then we can have a real more meaningful conversation.
Brilliant.
Well, I guess unless there were some burning points we missed that's still on your mind.
I don't think so. Naresh, this has been such a pleasure.
Yeah, it's been really a great delight for me as well. So we want to get to know you, because I have looked at work you've done and some videos you have on YouTube as well. And this has surpassed all of my expectations. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you indeed. And thank you to Trey for connecting us.
Yeah, so let's bring back Trey into the conversation. Trey, are you still awake?
Awake. My goodness, I'm energized. I expected nothing less. This conversation, as I shared, I've had conversations with each of you one-on-one on multiple occasions, and I just knew that the two of you coming together would be super wonderful. So thank you.
So may I request a copy of this recording as well, because I can, it will help me to circulate it internally to inform the discussions that have started to happen already about a CPI India.
Absolutely. Our intention with this is to, this is the first of a number of fireside chats that we're hoping to create with Naresh. And the whole objective isn't necessarily to make them formal podcasts so they could be, but it's also to assist bridge building and conversations and further convenings and collaborations, because that's where our hearts are. That's where my heart is. And so, gentlemen, as we wrap up the recording, just really want to briefly touch on, if anybody wants to reach either of you, what is the best way for them to do so? Could you offer that up?
Right. So perhaps for me, email. So it's naresh@jgu.edu.in. Quite simple.
Beautiful.
There are other emails, but that's the one for the university. That's
beautiful.
And of course, it's jgu. Maybe we need to put it down somewhere on the.
We'll place a few links referencing what Toby has been speaking about and what you've been speaking about. And Toby, is there a best way that you would prefer that people reach you?
Yeah, so shall I share? Email is generally the best way, because I'm a child of the late 20th century, really. So I can put that. The contact details are from the kind of my CPI webpage.
Okay, so via the Center for Public Impact.
Yeah, would it be helpful to share my screen just to show where that is?
That's okay. We'll have it posted, and you've placed it in the chat, so that's perfect.
Right, exactly.
I really want to give immense gratitude to both of you for sharing your hearts first and foremost, and your wisdom. I think that anyone who listens to this conversation will see that you are equally men of not just integrity and knowledge and intelligence, but that you're down to earth human beings who just really want something better for the world. And that, to me, that makes it really exciting to bring you both together. So thank you so much for your time, and I'm very much looking forward to further conversations and what we can co-create together.
Brilliant.
Thank you, Trey. Thank you for making this happen.
Thank you so much, Trey.
All right, my pleasure.